All right, we're on part 2 of our homeostasis and feedback systems PowerPoint as part of our unit. And we still have the same learning target. Remember I said we only had one, and that's that later on you're going to plan and conduct investigation to provide evidence that feedback mechanisms maintain homeostasis. And so our main objective today, in the last PowerPoint, you learned some characteristics of negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops. So today what you're going to do is explain examples of both positive and negative feedback loops, and to be able to identify, remember those 4 parts of the feedback loop that we talked about. Can you remember them? Remember, we start out with a sensor that detects some sort of change in your body, and it will relay that information to a control center, and that's usually your brain. And your brain's responsible, that control center is responsible for comparing this change in your body to what your normal conditions are like, what your normal set points are like. And from there, if it's off, the control center will send a message to a communication system that will relay the message to a target, and that target is going to respond in some way. And so today we're going to talk about examples of both positive and negative feedback loops, so you can kind of have a practice at identifying those different parts. So again, just to give you kind of an analogy, when we think about negative feedback loops, think about your thermostat at home. So let's say you go home from school and your apartment is cold. If your thermostat is set to a certain temperature, your thermostat will detect that your house has dropped below the normal set point, and it will turn on the heating. So if your apartment starts to drop too cold below that normal set point of what your thermostat is set at, it will automatically trigger your heating system, furnace or whatever, to turn on, and then the room will start to warm up. And then once it reaches your normal set point, that heating system will shut off, because now we've gotten you back. We've reversed the change. It was cold, and now by turning on the heating system, we've got the temperature back to the normal set point, so it's reversed the change back to normal. That's really what a negative feedback loop does, is it tries to keep the temperature constant in this case and at that normal set point. And so the little diagram there kind of shows you it kind of works both ways, whether it gets too hot, if it gets too warm, then it's going to shut off the heating system, and so it kind of cools down to the normal set point, vice versa. So let's look at an example in living things. Well, remember we talked about some of the different variables that that your body tries to always maintain homeostasis with. Some of them include your gases, your carbon dioxide levels and your oxygen levels in your body. And so one of the things we're going to look at here is carbon dioxide and how that affects your breathing rate. So if you, for example, tried to hold your breath for a while, or if you just started exercising a lot, both of those instances, your O2 levels in your blood are going to decrease, and your CO2 levels, your carbon dioxide levels, are going to increase. Well, when your carbon dioxide levels in your blood increase, they actually cause your blood to become acidic. And remember, our blood is supposed to have that normal set point of right around 7.4 or so, so it's slightly basic. And so in this case, your levels would drop below the set point. So sensors in your blood vessels, in your circulatory system and in your respiratory system, they would detect that your blood's too acidic, that you have too much CO2 in your blood, and your blood is now acidic, and they're going to send that message to your brain, to your control center. Your brain is going to compare what your normal set points should be, so what your normal pH of your blood, again, is supposed to be right around that, about 7.4 or so, and it's comparing that with what your blood is now. And you've got too much CO2 in your blood, and so it's a little bit more acidic than it should be. So your brain is now going to send a message to a communication system. In this case, it's going to be your nervous system, okay? Your nervous system is going to act like a communication system because it's going to send a message to the muscles of your diaphragm and rib cage. These are going to be your targets. Again, sometimes we refer to them as your effectors. And what those targets do is they respond in some way. Well, how are they going to respond? They're going to start to contract and relax based on those nerve impulses that are coming to them. And that's what causes you to inhale and exhale. Well, as you do that, you're going to get rid of that excess carbon dioxide and bring in more oxygen, and therefore your levels should get back to normal. And if your CO2 levels get back to normal, that means the pH in your blood will get back to normal as well. And so the whole goal is to return to your normal set points. Remember, negative feedback loops try to reverse the change. You know, your set point is either above or below what it should be. And so how your body responds is to try to get you back to that normal set point. So here's a little diagram that kind of shows you that. Normal blood around 7.4, they kind of give a range to 7.6, but really 7.4 is probably a good point for your blood as far as pH. So exercise requires oxygen and produces carbon dioxide, and that relates to cell respiration, which we'll get back to in one of our units the second semester. And so that high level of CO2 then lowers your pH. And that gets detected by your brain then when those sensors send that message. The brain then sends a signal, again, via the nervous system, which is your communication system. And that's going to tell your lungs and diaphragm to start contracting and relaxing, and your breathing rate increases. Extra carbon dioxide gets removed and more O2 is taken in. Okay? And so this will go back and make it move around the cycle there to form that loop. And this is a negative feedback loop. It's trying to reverse the change back to the normal set point. It's trying to counteract whatever change has occurred in the body to get you back to your normal levels. In this case, it's talking about CO2 levels and pH levels. In other instances, it might be talking about body temperature or glucose levels. So whenever your body's trying to reverse the change and get you back to your normal set points by counteracting it, that's a negative feedback loop. Now, positive feedback loops, let's again use another example that's not part of your body. Apple ripening. A lot of you know, or have probably been around an apple tree. Maybe you've gotten a chance to go to an apple orchard and pick an apple, but have you ever wondered how one apple starts to ripen and pretty soon, within a couple days, it seems like the whole tree is ripened, all the apples are ready to pick? How does that happen? Well, that's a positive feedback mechanism, because what happens is when an apple starts to ripen, it releases what's called ethylene gas. And ethylene gas causes neighboring apples to ripen. So here you have an apple that ripens on a tree. It produces ethylene, and it signals that any neighbors around it, so any apples that are right next to that apple, they're going to start to ripen. Well, guess what? The neighbors produce more ethylene. That causes more apples to ripen. And then they cause their neighbors to produce more ethylene, and it just keeps going and going and going in this cycle until all apples on tree have ripened. So remember, we talked about in a positive feedback mechanism, it's not like you're one and done and you reverse the change and you're back to normal. No, in this case, we keep going and going and going We're amplifying the kind of the change away from it until we get to some end product, the end result that we want, okay? And so usually you have this kind of mini cycle within the cycle that happens. So let's look at an example in real life. Now, guys, you don't have to worry about this, but if you ever get married, hey, and you guys, you and your wife have kids, you'll have to be there when she's maybe screaming at you. No, hopefully you're just there to support her. But maybe one way to help your wife get through her contractions is you can talk about that this is a positive feedback mechanism, right? No? Okay. Anyway, let's go through it step by step. As the first contractions, as a pregnant woman, she's getting into the end of her 9 months here, and as those first contractions act as a stimulus, they're going to trigger and start to move the baby. We say the baby drops and it starts moving closer to the cervix, which is the lower part of the uterus where the baby has been held throughout this time. There are stretch-sensitive nerve cells or sensors in the cervix, and they kind of monitor the degree of stretching, because remember, that baby has to come out, okay? So nerve cells, then, those stretch-sensitive nerve cells, which act as your sensors in this case, they're going to send a message to the brain. Remember, that's your control center. This is going to signal the pituitary gland to release a hormone called oxytocin, and that's going to enter into the bloodstream. Now, anytime we are talking about hormones, that means your communication system is the endocrine system, because it is sending out a hormone, and that hormone is going to go to a target area. It's going to go to the target that's going to respond in some way. So in this case, that hormone oxytocin is going to go to the target, which are the smooth muscles of the uterus, and it's going to cause them to contract. And as that contraction occurs, it causes further stretching signaling, so more oxytocin is released. And as more oxytocin is released, it causes more contractions of the uterus to occur, which causes more oxytocin to be released, which causes more contractions to occur until it's one on top of the other. And yeah, let me tell you, I have 3 kids, and it's not a fun deal. It's very painful. But that cycle, it's like a cycle within a cycle. It's like more oxytocin gets released, causing more contractions, which causes more oxytocin to get released, which causes more contractions. That just continues on and on and on until the baby is born. Okay? That is the end result in this case. And so with a positive feedback loop, it's moving you further and further away from your normal set points. Believe me, as those contractions come on faster and faster and harder, it's definitely moving away from your normal set point of not feeling pain, and your body reacting as normally. It hurts and it's tough and all that. And so this is an example of a positive feedback loop. Now, here just shows you a little bit of picture. Again, when the head of the baby starts pushing against the cervix, it's going to send nerves in there. Those sensory nerves are going to transmit a signal to your brain, which is going to signal your pituitary gland to secrete oxytocin. That's carried to the bloodstream to the uterus, and that's going to stimulate the uterus to contract, which then signals more oxytocin to be released, and so on until the baby is born. And so as you can see, here's that inner loop within there that just keeps going and going and going until finally the baby is born. Okay? So that's an example of a positive feedback loop. Think about it. If that was a negative feedback loop, that means the reverse would have been changed right away. You know how nice, how much women would love it if all you had to do is, have one contraction, push once, and the baby's out? Yeah, that'd be great. Unfortunately, it's not like that. So it's a positive feedback loop. It's going to keep going and going and going, moving you away from that set point until finally the baby is born. So let's read this little scenario, and let's see if you can figure out what type of feedback loop this is, as well as what are the 4 different parts of the feedback loop. Chemoreceptors are structures that detect high levels of CO2 in the blood, carbon dioxide. Chemoreceptors send messages to the medulla of the brain. The brain sends impulses to the respiratory muscles to increase the rate of breathing, therefore bringing more oxygen and decreasing the amount of CO2 in the blood until levels are normal. It sounds pretty much like our example we had in our notes. But let's see if we can find the parts this time. The sensor would be those chemoreceptors because they are detecting the change. In this case, it's a high level of CO2. So we put chemoreceptors here. Okay. And then the control center, remember, a sensor is going to send a message. In this case, it's to the medulla of the brain. That's the medulla oblongata. And maybe what, any of you have seen the movie Waterboy? Medulla oblongata. All right, anyway. Look it up. There's a little part of the scene that's pretty good. The brain sends impulses to the respiratory muscles to increase the rate of breathing. So the respiratory muscles would probably be things like your diaphragm. I can't spell it in there. And rib muscles. Okay. So what do you suppose is triggering your diaphragm and rib muscles, you know, kind of your rib cage and stuff, your muscles around there to move? Usually that means it's being stimulated by a nerve impulse. Anytime your muscles contract, that means a nerve impulse is being sent that way. There's no mention of any kind of hormone or anything like that, so we know it's not the endocrine system. So in this case, they're not telling you what the communication system is, but we know if there's some sort of movement of the body, of any muscles in the body, that means it has to be the nervous system that is causing that, because the nervous system sends electrical impulses that cause contraction of your muscles, whether that be your arm muscles, leg muscles, in this case your rib cage and diaphragm. So what is the target or the effector? That would be those respiratory muscles. Again, I'm not spelling this right at all. Sorry. Rib cage and diaphragm. I'm spelling it diagram, I think. Fram. Oh dear. Sorry, guys. What type of feedback would this be? Because it's trying to, by increasing your breathing, it's trying to increase your O2 and decrease the amount of CO2 because your levels were too high. So are we moving you further away, or are we reversing the change? We are reversing the change, right? Because if we had too high of levels and now we're decreasing the amount, that means this would be a negative feedback loop. Okay? Because we're trying to counteract or reverse the change. We're not moving further and further away from the set point. Okay? So make sure you understand all those as we go through and be able to really look through a scenario. You're going to have some more practice with this with some of your quizzes and other assignments. But can you, and you're going to have to do this for your lab as well, can you pick out the different parts of the feedback loop? And by what's happening, can you determine, is this a positive or negative feedback loop?